Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of KRVIA, I welcome all those who have joined in the Encounter Lecture series with us. Today, we will be having Mr. Ranjit Hoskote. Has been acclaimed as a seminal contributor to the Indian art criticism and curatorial practice, and is also a leading Indian poet. In today's encounter, he will be discussing the role of research in poetry, not usually seen as an art that is related to research. He will refer to his book Jonah Whale, which addresses the maritime histories of empire, colonialism, voyaging, and slavery, and will be speaking of his engagement with Persian encyclopedias, Ottoman cartography, the role of Jahazis in global shipping, and other narratives that lead away from a normalized Eurocentric worldview. Welcome to KRVIA. The mic and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Madhura and Mamta. It's really a great pleasure to be here for multiple reasons. One is, as I've discovered, there is an entire mafia from my old school, which seems to have infiltrated the KRVIA faculty, which is a delight because it takes you back to long ago time. Also, because my practically the only academic job as such that I've ever had it was when I taught at KRVIA for 1 year at the invitation of Sen Kapadia, who was the founding director. And I did aesthetics with the first batch of KRVIA, which is quite a historic batch. There are many distinguished architects in that batch now, but I remember them as bright young students, sometimes very skeptical about why they, who came from essentially a concentration on mathematics and the sciences, needed to know anything at all about aesthetics or art history. This was a very long time ago, 1992. Much has changed in architecture pedagogy in India since, but I've followed the trajectories of these students of mine over the years, and it makes me very, very happy to see how their practices are flowered. So what I thought I'd do today, and I have to say before I start, the trouble with having a hybrid practice, which is distributed over artistic expression, in my case poetry, and academic or scholarly work, in my case cultural theory and art criticism. The danger is that these things tend to bleed into each other. So you're tempted to write a brief or abstract, as I did for my lecture, which sounds incredibly scholarly. But what I want to do today is to bring to what I'm saying those worlds of affect and emotion and are not always acknowledged feeling that actually sustain and nourish all artistic expression. So as we go along, I want to see if we can bring these things into play. What does it mean to have a hybrid practice, where one part of you could well be critical and discursive, another part more empathetic and expressive? And this is something I'm aware that my primary audience today is, in fact, architects and designers. So it's something we face, something you face as well. Whilst preparing for this yesterday, I just asked myself, what is the meaning of falling water? I mean, is it, as our friend Corbusier would have said, is it just a house for living? Is it a machine for living? Or are we to embrace it for its extraordinary ability to interpenetrate outside and inside the natural elements and human-made form? I think it's a question that architects particularly have to ask, the relationship between the expressive, the intuitive, and all that concerns affect and everything that is functional and critical. But it's something that all of us, poets, theater makers, filmmakers, novelists, all of us face these questions. What I also want to do as I go along is to reflect a little on how my poetry has, over the years, come to find, if you will, its themes. This happens to all of us on an artistic journey. Some of us are fortunate enough to find that theme early in life. Others work their way towards it. In my case, there's been a convergence, and I'm going to speak really from a memoir of practice here. In my case, there was a convergence between what I was most preoccupied by at the level of existential identity, questions of cultural engagement, and questions of how I saw history, and what I was doing in my poetry. Now, for some reason, poetry still tends to widely be thought of as an escape from reality. It's as if it escapes the gravity of all that is urgent and flies off into some kind of la-la land of fantasy. Now, this is an unfortunate misconception. If anything, poetry actually engages very closely with the urgencies of life. It invites us to look at all that is not disclosed, that is urgent, that's compelling, that seizes us along the human adventure. For me, this has meant over the years also thinking about what it means to be a post-colonial subject of a certain kind, what it means to have inherited plural pasts, what it means to have inherited, in my particular case, a diasporic history within South Asia, which leaves me immune to the seductions of tight regional identities. And that's allowed me to open up to also ask myself questions like, how do we identify ourselves as historical subjects? What does it mean to be Indian? What does it mean to be the inheritor of 5,000 years of history, which are evidence to plurality, to voyages, to journeys, to interactions, to exchanges, to things that came from here and from elsewhere, how these things came together? So about 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, Ilya Troyanov, the German novelist, and I wrote a book called Confluences, which really looked at this question in its historical depth and density. We looked at Kushan, India, much of which is now in Pakistan and Afghanistan, of course. We looked at Al-Andalus, which is the 700 to 800 years of this incredible ecumeny where in Spain, where Muslims, Jews, and Christians worked together, produced new cultures, new texts, new translations. So our preoccupation was really with confronting all those ideologies that tell us that we are all unique and pure in our cultural identity, and we always have to be in a position of antagonism towards the other. Now, unfortunately, the world is trapped in this kind of idea. More and more political forces across the world are telling us that we need to see ourselves in this way. Our historical experience tells us the exact opposite, that we've actually been nourished and sustained by embracing the risk of difference, by embracing the other, by going into intermediate gray zones and collaborating, by reading together, by learning one another's languages and religions, by thus producing culture. Culture doesn't come ready-made. It doesn't fall from heaven. It doesn't come from a primal, pure, unique source. It's made through mixtures, through hybridities, through dialogue, conversation, and also conflict. So that was my theoretical journey, if you will. And increasingly in the last few years, as a poet, I've been preoccupied with questions of what to do with my chosen form. To a large extent, as an Anglophone poet, I've inherited what you might want to call the English personal lyric. This emerges from, essentially, I'm going to summarize brutally here. It emerges from the Romantic period. It privileges the gaze and the voice of the sovereign individual, looking out at the world and establishing a series of relationships with that world through a reasonably short, self-contained poem, which in shorthand we'll call the lyric. Now, this form, this personal lyric, tends to have certain occupational hazards, one of which is that you begin to look inward, you begin to think that your narrow personal experience is cosmically important. And it can lead you to a sort of narcissism, which I find dangerous for any art. And over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen a gradual process by which many, many practitioners across the world have questioned this narrow personal lyric. They've asked themselves how it's to be opened up. How does the individual I open itself to embrace a multitude of experiences? And in my case, that's exactly what I've been doing in the last few years. I've tried to see how this personal lyric can actually become a ground where a polyphony of voices can be heard. Because this is the nature of our experience in the Capitalocene or the Anthropocene. This year of pandemic and lockdown has really brought this home for us. Even before that, we knew from the ecological crises that have summoned us to a place of attention to the planet. We know that anything we do here could have consequences in Nigeria, in the Philippines, in Alaska. the melting of the polar caps is going to lead to rising sea levels here in Bombay. We're living in the world of the butterfly effect, and our destinies here are connected to the destinies of people we don't know, we don't see, we'll never know. And that is, to me, the great existential condition today, this interrelationship of destinies. So how do I, with the one or two pages available to me, how do I bring into this space, which is my ground, how do I bring into that this larger awareness of what it means to be in this interrelated planet? How can I voice or amplify the voices of people who've historically been voiceless or are being marginalized today? Equally, since I'm also a translator, the question of expanding the ambit of language itself has been very, very important to me. So as you see, I inhabit different histories and different, if you will, also professional domains. Now, as a poet who's a translator, it's been important to me to break down the line that separates my poetic practice and my translatorial practice, which was also a way of asking myself, I'm committed to writing in English for historical reasons. It's effectively my first language and my first language of expression. But I am, for equally historical reasons, a multilingual person. So how do I bring my other languages into how I write, what I write? Including really a meditation on why so many of us are preoccupied with language as this citadel that we have to defend in its purity against all other things. All languages, including and especially English, have proceeded through absorption, through osmosis. Look at the hundreds of words, even at the level of loan words, hundreds of words that English has absorbed from the various languages of South Asia. Go deep down to the historic levels, the archaic levels of English, and you'll find words that came from Norse, from Anglo-Saxon. All these word layers, these strata of words, bear witness to journeys, to voyages, in fact, to what the sea tells us in my title. Yeah. So this is what I've been doing, particularly in the poems that have gone into this most recent book called Jonah Whale. I never know what to do with these screens. When I try to bring an object into the screen, it seems to go off. So I'm going to try and do the opposite and hope for the best. Yup, Jonah Whale. Yeah, which has also appeared in the UK as the Atlas of Lost Beliefs. The screen's doing its thing again. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to read. I don't want to make one edition feel bad at the expense of the other. So I'm going to read from both books, both editions, whilst also speaking over the slides, because I've done what I said I wouldn't do, which is to open with this very theoretically loaded kind of prelude, but I'm hoping you caught also the existential questions and urgencies that inform these themes of mine. Yeah. So just to round off what I was saying about being a poet and being a translator, and also allowing for other kinds of arts. I'm fascinated. I've had a lifelong fascination with Hindustani classical music, for instance. My earliest memories have to do with the LPs that my parents played on a garage turntable, which to my alarm and distress I saw is now a vintage item online. But I remember hearing Velayat Khan Saab's Yaman, Bismillah Khan Saab's Rag Durga, alongside with all kinds of other things. So music was terribly important to me. So one of the questions I've asked myself now in these new poems is, why can't I bring that notion of tal, of cadence, or lay, tempo, or the words of the song texts, the bandishes from Hindustani classical music? How do I bring them into my now expanded sense of the lyric? Which has led me to think back to what histories those bandishes bring us. And many of them, these bandishes, particularly for tumris and for kajris, they're in the voice of the woman. They're woman's music. In fact, this is why historically they've been slighted as light classical music. I don't know what this absurd term means, except that it encodes a patriarchal belief that women's music is automatically light and not to be taken seriously. The truth is that these forms encode immense experiences of historical suffering. The bandishes speak to us of forced labor, of migration, of the men moving away, of the denudation of villages. So those song texts are not just some kind of scaffolding for music. They also come to us with their own histories. And I'm going to talk as I move on to the slides of how some of this has come into my work. Yeah. So I'm going to now try and see if I can get to, I'm going to say share. And by magic, all appears, and it's even full screen, right? Or is it? Yep, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to now pull back from my assorted remarks and try and draw you into the presence of my poems and what they've been drawing on. So what you see here is from one of the early encyclopedias in the world, the Jami al-Tawarik, which was written by a Persian Jewish scholar who converted to Islam, Rashid al-Din, working for a Mongol patron of the Ilkhanid Empire, who had meanwhile converted from his ancestral shamanic religion to Islam, which was the new and spreading religion of the time. So I want you to think back to a time in Iran and Central Asia where a new religion was expanding, but embracing all that had gone before in terms of culture and religious impulses and literature. It's here between over the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries that great uh, enterprises of translation took place. Whether it was the Abbasids or the Ilkhanids, they presided over a project of translation which took the Sanskrit and the Greek classics over into Arabic. And as these texts made their way across North Africa and into Al-Andalus in Spain, they brought into Europe, which meanwhile was sunk in the Dark Ages, they brought all this Greek and Sanskrit and Persian knowledge into Europe, where it fed Renaissance humanism and eventually the Enlightenment. Now, this is not a record of history that you normally get because we've all internalized some Eurocentric mad idea that the Renaissance drew automatically upon Greek sources and brought the light of Europe to the world. That wasn't exactly true. And I want to focus on the Jami al-Tawarik here because looking at these old encyclopedias or at Al-Idrisi's great atlas, the Kitab al-Rujar, looking at these non-Western forms of knowledge making, of acquiring a sense of the world, really makes us shift our perspective. It makes us think about other forms of knowledge production, other sources and locations of knowledge production. And it also allows us to see how texts, far from being stable and trapped within one tradition, actually have place in multiple traditions. And translation also makes that possible. So the prophet known as Jonah in the Old Testament is Yunus in the Islamic tradition. The great sea monster in one case becomes the vast fish in another. And it's when stories travel and ripple out that they really carry with them their sense not only of a divine framework, but they help you to think about the unpredictable and vulnerable human being that is at the center of these stories. And even as a child, I was always attracted to the figure of Jonah or Yunus, because Jonah is a highly unlikely prophet. He never does what God tells him to do. Those of you who have read your book of Jonah in the Bible will know this. He does the exact opposite of what God asks him to do. He's asked to go to one place, he goes to another, lands up on a ship. They realize he's cursed, so they toss him into the water. He spends 3 nights in the belly of the fish, meditating. He comes out, he's always questioning God. He's always questioning what's marked out for him. And in that sense, he's a profoundly modern figure, questioning authority, wanting to make his own way forward, and then stitching together epiphanies and enlightenments and what has been won through a difficult experience. So I'm going to read a poem called Ocean from Jonah Whale, which addresses a number of these questions and where somebody like Jonah is an inspiring figure in the background. And this is the poem. It's called Ocean, and it goes like this. My name is Ocean. I shall not be contained. My tides spell starting gun and finish line. Afterwards, only shells and scattered roofs will remind you I was there. My combers wash away the roots of trees, towns, the shaken heart. but mortals, there's hope. My breakers hurl seeds back at your shores. After the flood, the chroniclers will write in Konkani, Sabir, Aymara, Tulu, Jarawa, Creole, Tok Pisin. After the flood, the beach exploded with giant peacock trees, in whose branches, on windy days, you could hear the surge and swell of ocean summoning whales, whalers who chased bloodwakes, red-haired women who fought pirates, sleepless harpooners who sailed from fjordlands to where volcanoes splintered the sleeping ice, furies who choked pearl divers, drove catamarans aground, voyagers who fell into the sea and grew wings, ocean reciting from his depths every drifting epic of pursuit, every song of shipwreck, every trace of raft and sail and trailing anchor, flotsam, jetsam, buckram, vellum, he could remember. And like many of my poems, Ocean grew out of fragments, of notations, of uh, thinking about what it means to live on the margin of the sea, as I've always done. I was born in Bombay, spent part of my childhood in Goa, came back to Bombay, and wherever I've traveled and lived elsewhere, I've somehow found myself on the banks of a river or at a seashore. So the sea is a compelling presence for me. And I've often thought about what it might mean for us to have atlases where we take the oceans as our continents and reduce the continents, just flip our normal sense of the globe or the atlas. If you do that, you find that you're liberated from the land-bound, the landlocked histories that we all are taught at school, which are really constantly histories of having to protect your turf, being invaded, so on and so forth. It's not like the sea doesn't have histories of invasion, but the histories of the sea are also histories of dialogue, of conversation, of the way languages migrate, of how you create new languages. So the list of languages that I have in this poem, there's a bit of an irony because most of them are languages that either have multiple scripts or are being marginalized or are being overwhelmed by larger, more standard languages. So when I think about the histories of the sea, I'm also thinking of everything that is vulnerable in the histories of the sea, what it tells us about how far more plural we actually are and have always been. So Moby Dick, and I'm going to leap because the slides are not in a chronological order. I didn't want that. I'm going to leap from one to another of my preoccupations. I've always been fascinated by the maritime literature of the 18th and 19th centuries. It emerges from, of course, histories of colonialism, of empire. It typically enshrines the male, typically white hero. And growing up, it was always a question to me. I loved all this as literature. Moby Dick, Herman Melville, for instance, a lot of Arthur Conan Doyle's writing, Jack London, many of these things that, at least for my longer or vanished generation, these were important. But I always thought to myself, what role do I play in this? I am inspired by and would identify with some of these protagonists, but I feel much, much closer to uh, the Indian, the broadly African, the Caribbean figures who tend to be either the enemy or marginalized or somehow heroic but defeated figures in these narratives. So there was a great sense of being a distressed reader, if you will. How does one deal with this question as readers? Where do we distribute our sense of selfhood, especially when we inherit these tense, plural, vexed histories? So for me, especially in the Joe Noel poems, one way of embracing Moby Dick was really to look at it in its complexity as uh, a text written in the moment of the colonial, but embodying many different voices. So in one of the poems in the book called Redburn, I actually take a chapter from one of Melville's other books, Redburn, and I overwrite it. I put in bandishes uh, from Hindustani music, which refer to how men have gone away to sea, how they've gone away as labor, we know, to Fiji or to Trinidad. And the language, the Avadi, the Braj, all this comes in, and it, in a rich way, I think anyway, really breaks open Melville's text, which is in English. It also looks at the points in Melville's text which are very, very empathetic to the people he meets. The chapter has to do with how he comes aboard a boat that's really run by Indians and how he begins to learn from them. It's a marvelous chapter and a marvelous book, Red Burnett suggested to you. And I also began to think of what kind of figure was Ahab, who's at the center of Moby Dick. And he became a very, very crucial figure in this book. So I'm going to read from a poem called Ahab, which is a longer poem, but I'm going to just share with you how an avatar of Ahab inhabits how I deal with this text in this poem. Ahab, captain of castaways, the pilot calls out, and his curse carries across docks, derricks, opium factories, a typhoon in the hoarse latitudes. He's hurled his ship after the whale that swallowed him and spat him out. The monster is the only system he's known. At the bridge, he's drenched in the dark, locked on target, silent, furrowed, saturned to stone. Across steep tides, through walls of water, his life has always been pursuit. As the ship splinters on the reef, the rigging becomes his noose. Brine blistering his throat, he thinks, if only I'd harpooned this monster on a page. And to me, Ahab, in his absolute inability to let the whale go, in his desire to subjugate nature, in his mad desire to enslave all his crew. And there's a beautiful line in Moby Dick where Herman Melville talks of how there's an incipient sultanism to Ahab, the captain. I just found how incredibly prescient Melville was. So Ahab becomes the figure of a capitalism gone mad, a form of trade and of the exploitation of nature which compels the planet, which would destroy its resources. So Ahab leaps out of this mid-19th century novel and becomes literally a monster for today. You know, the monster is the only system he's known, as I say here. And he comes out of what I see as the 19th century's own moment of capital with its docks, derricks, opium factories that I dwell on in the poem, and it becomes relevant to us today. It's a cautionary tale, really. I also found myself wonderfully inspired by pre-Columban and non-Columban cartographies in all the research that went into this book. And the reason, again, is because it helps us, especially those of us who are located in the global south, to remind ourselves that we weren't sitting around here waiting to be discovered after 1492. We had our own knowledge systems. They were perfectly adequate. They had their own metrics. They had their own cosmology. And when I think of Zhong He, for instance, the Chinese Muslim eunuch admiral who explored the Indian Ocean, or when I think, for instance, of Piri Reis, who was this Ottoman admiral and cartographer of the 16th century, or Al-Idrisi, who created this early atlas in the Middle Ages for his Norman patron, Roger of Sicily, you begin to think about how the world can be seen from a totally different angle. Al-Idrisi's atlas takes south as north. It takes the old canopic Egyptian system where south is up, north is down. So in one gesture, you're knocked back. Your whole understanding of the globe changes. With Piri Reis, you see how his point of reference is the East Mediterranean. All his maps refer to a relationship to Istanbul. Here, for instance, he's thinking about the Nile Delta. And eventually, it also leads us to think about how there are bodies of knowledge that are encoded in scripts we can't read, languages that we have to learn. And, you know, we're reminded that knowledge is really not about power necessarily. It's also about curiosity. So I'm not going to read a poem for every map in the interests of time, or every image in the interests of time, but I just want to throw in some of these things to create, as it were, a cartography of my own references. These are the Jahazis that were spoken of in the introduction. Again, what is often treated in a master narrative as the age of discovery or the age of exploration, we forget that it wasn't always the Portuguese or the Dutch or the English or the French hero, the great navigator. No one tells us, unless we are specialists in academia, no one tells us that the crews were literally the motley crews. They were crews that came from the Konkan, from Bihar, from Orissa, from the Andhra coast, from the Malay Islands, from the east coast of Africa. There were Jews, there were people from Benin, and they've left their traces in the language. So I'm going to read a poem here, which actually is called Laskar. Laskar is, of course, many of you know, comes from Lashkar, the Urdu word via Persian for soldier, but also for sailor. Laskar, Bombay, Liverpool, London, 1889. The Lascar was always sallow. It didn't help that his name anagrammed rascal. He carried a whiff of scurvy, a hint of rats in the hold, hulls battered by typhoons. He was never far from dirty work. Here's what the detective said. There's a trapdoor at the back of that opium den, near the wharf, which could tell strange tales of what passes through it on moonless nights. Here's what the good wife said. At the foot of the stairs, I met this Lascar, who thrust me back, and aided by a Dane, pushed me out into the street. Meanwhile, her husband, only one man knew my secret. He was the keeper of a low den in which I used to lodge, a Lascar, well paid by me for his rooms. My secret was safe with him. Neither detective, nor wife, nor husband knew the bleached village on the Konkan coast, or had seen the forced parades at tropical noon, the forts locked in rising silt, the standing crops burnt. History gave you one name. Fear gave you and your cousins others. To novelists, savage. To pamphleteers, cannibal. To scholars, anthropophage. To your captains, Sikani, Tyndall, Sirang, Topaz, or mostly, as you swabbed the deck, cocoa-faced rascal. You call yourself names in the three tongues you speak in your sleep. Lashkar, Tandale, Jahazi. They crowd us into the damp, shallow cradle they call the forecastle. Silly name. Furna, we call it. Furna, the hood, the wide, fan-spread hood of this coiled sea cobra we're sailing. And again, I'll annotate this briefly. Usually as a critic, I annotate other people's poetry. Here I'm in the strange situation of having to annotate my own, but here we go. What I've tried to do here really is also literally to recover through the medium of using some of these Lashkari terms or terms from Indian coastal life and maritime history that have come into English. I've tried to draw back those histories. English maritime history has these words, Tyndall and Sirang. They refer to particular kinds of personnel on a boat or a ship. Now, those of us who live in Bombay and around will recognize where those names come. They come from time-honored occupational surnames that the Koli community bears, Tandale and Sarang, for instance. So at the end of the poem, I have this twist where I take this, this navigational term from English, forecastle, and overthrow it with a word that comes really from Marathi, fana. It's also a way of using a syllable that is not present in English, a retroflex sound, dana, and it comes right into the middle of a language that doesn't have that sound. So for me, it's a minor way of pointing out the traces of difference. And I'm not going, in the interests of time, I'm going to, and also because this helps me to invite you to read the book, I'm going to also talk about how there are other less optimistic histories of the sea which come into our knowledge and come into the book. So there's a long choric poem in the book called Cargo and Ballast, which I'm not going to read, which is a long form elegy for one of the most inhuman and vicious things that human beings have done to other human beings. It was for a long time called the Atlantic trade. It was the slave trade, which transported millions of men, women, and children across the Atlantic from the coasts of Africa to work on sugar plantations, to work in cotton fields, and which really drove an engine of modernity. Without that slave labor, we wouldn't have had modernity. And you see here the conditions in which typically about 600 individuals, men, women, children, were taken across the ocean. And my poem, Cargo and Ballast, is actually an elegy and a lament for one of the very worst cases. It's known as the Zong Massacre, where this is what Turner's painting refers to, where the slavers, because they'd made all kinds of mistakes with navigation, they'd overloaded the boat, the ship, they just began to throw enslaved persons who were ill overboard. And it was one of the most horrible moments in this ugly history. And it really eventually helped change the law. Even the judge who tried the case had to register his shock that human beings were being regarded as cargo to be thrown overboard if they went bad. So I'm going to maybe read one part of this long poem just to give you a sense of how it also takes on and amplifies the voices of somebody like the Martinique philosopher Edouard Glissant, who's dwelt on these questions. And I'm going to read this part of it. Everything will be used against you, beginning with the abyss. Thing of breath and muscle you swing from the belly of the slave ship to the violet belly of the ocean. You did not weave this sail, you did not stitch this shroud on this Noah boat, this Jonah boat, this giant stickleback. No anchor, no anchorage. Pray for the life to come after the convoy of sharks when the time comes. Everything will be used against you, beginning with chalk, sulfur, ochre earth, jagged bamboo, rotund cane, and the blades and axle shafts of words that were javelined at you and that you turned into bird calls, passwords, anthems, spells. Original victim floating towards the sea's abysses. You call to the spirits of so many who never came up from the hold, from the stomach of the ocean, to breathe the heavy air of Black River. You hear their voices echo in the voices of these islands. You wear betrayal like a matted skin. You wear betrayal like an armor. You wear betrayal like a brocade doublet. Our boats are open, you sing, and we sail them for everyone when the time comes. And you'll want to know what this has to do with us here, and my answer to that is threefold. One, quoting John Donne, who wrote, "No man is an island." The destinies of what happened to people from Western Africa are linked to what happened with us. Both of these are parts that fit together in a larger narrative of colonial exploitation and brutal empire building. Another answer would be that we ourselves here on the west coast of India, and indeed elsewhere, even in Bengal, were not innocent of the slave trade. Bombay talks about itself as a cotton capital. It's come to terms with the fact that it was an opium capital. We have yet to talk about ourselves as a depot in the slave trade. And that's something I explore in my next book of poems. But for now, I'm just going to invite you to think about that. An ironic aside is that the slave colony in Bombay, which was called Madagascar Town, stood on the site where Liberty Cinema today stands. So I'll ask you to dwell on that irony. And also, in a year that's seen the most incredible struggle against the structural violence and injustice in North America, let's remind ourselves that we in India have also, through our own bizarre practice of caste apartheid, we have also practiced Afrophobia against the many people from the various African countries who've come here as students or have settled here. And to me, this reflection is not about something that happens far away and distant and that happened centuries ago. These crises, these dilemmas are still very, very strongly with us, and we need to develop an ethical view of who we are going to be in these situations. And I think I'm going to end with how am I doing on time? Okay. I'm going to now move far back in time, and you might think far away from the sea. But again, from the point of view of thinking about many of these themes that I've tried to elaborate on today. Because this reminds us of a time when Greeks who came by sea and by land to India became part of a larger churning of culture and became part of this larger story of India. Some of our earliest Buddhist iconography emerges in this period. Some of our earliest Hindu iconography, Vaishnava and Shaivite, emerges in this period in the coins and the votives of the Indo-Greeks and later the Kushans. And it was an early lesson in how to be culturally plural. So I'm going to read a poem called Bactrian Drachma, which I'll end. It's dedicated to a dear childhood friend who is now a museum curator specializing precisely in Indian numismatics at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, Shailendra Bhandari. Bactrian Drachma for Shailendra Bhandari. On one side, a face that's been kissed, spat on, spun in bright air, Basileus. Tyrant, mining dry valleys, far from Homer's wine-dark sea. On the other, rimmed by a halo of worn ass-lip script, Tratar, a cave-born echo, never heard the same twice, never fully deciphered. And I'm going to end with that poem and those reflections because it reminds us of a time when speakers of Greek and speakers of Sanskrit and the Sanskrit-descended languages were coming together. It reminds us also that Ashoka's edicts were written in multiple languages. Some of them were in Greek, some of them were in the Kharoshthi script. It's something we need to remember today. At a time when people want to impose one or another kind of language on anyone, we are able to be fully ourselves when we expand ourselves across these petty little borders of religion, race, ethnicity, and language. And when we can think of ourselves as reflecting on Basileus, the Greek notion of the emperor, and Tratar, the Sanskrit notion of the savior. So with a general appeal that we should not believe that the past is primordially present, that we should see it as something constantly to be revisited, to be deciphered, to be reinterpreted. I'm going to close here, and if there are questions or observations, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your poems, and we do have questions, so we'll be taking them up now. Super. I'll read them out to you.
Okay.
The first question says, would you consider someone like Captain Nemo to be a unique perspective in the literally classics of his times,
Sure.
who despite not being a protagonist, still was a former subject of the British Empire, who rebelled against it by leaving their jurisdiction and firmly roots it as the real antagonist of Verne's story, especially given the contrast between the British ships and the Nautilus?
Totally brilliant, wonderful question. Thank you so much. Because Nemo, of course, as I've said I have actually annotated these poems elsewhere in interviews and so on. So I've often said that for me, this figure of this isolated yet empathetic mariner draws on Odysseus, on Ahab, on Nemo. So Nemo, particularly for me, has always been an extremely important figure. And when you look at the role he plays in the fiction of Jules Verne, he also appears in The Mysterious Island. Now, the chronologies of those novels are slightly mixed up, but forget that for the moment. The key point is that Nemo is an anti-colonial figure. And such is the beauty of text, of narrative, that at the end, you're left with a deep sympathy for Nemo. So, whilst it might be conventional in a certain kind of reading to see him as the antagonist, he's the true protagonist. He's the one who, despite having been treated so brutally, having lost his family and friends and his people in what we know to be 1857, the uprising, he goes away and he seeks vengeance, as he says, on the world's powers. And that's brutal because he sometimes sinks passenger ships. But there are those moments in the novel when he reaches out and saves the dying pearl diver on the coast of Sri Lanka and puts a bag of pearls into his hands and sends him off. This is somebody who has deep empathy for the vulnerable, the suffering, the colonial populations. We also know that Verne originally had in mind a Polish protagonist for the role of Nemo, but his publisher felt that that might lose him publishing contracts and readers in Russia. The Poles were fighting Russian colonialism at the time. But when he switched to this Indian protagonist, he drew equally on an incredible history, and with great sympathy, he reached out to this to the history of what was happening in India at the time. And remember that Verne also was a prolific writer. Had as another protagonist in another novel, Nana Sahib, and I've long ago wrote a little prose text. I wrote a text about how, in my view, Nemo actually is Nana Sahib in the way in which Verne elaborates his universe. So yeah, I totally agree with you. Nemo is certainly a figure in my poems in Jonah Whale, and I regard him as a true protagonist and an anti-colonial figure. I would read the novel against the grain of how we've been taught to read it.
Thank you so much. It was an enormous question, so I'm pretty sure this would have summed up your views about it. We have another question that says, has the rise of air travel taken away this travel-based interpretation of the sea to the more romantic and melancholic Dover Beach-esque meaning, modern poetry, or is it still seen as the global crossroads of oceanic travel?
Okay, thank you for the question again. What's actually happened, and you're absolutely right, it's not so much air travel because that's been with us since the age of the jet, which was whenever it was, 1950s, maybe, yeah, whenever jet travel begins. That actually destroyed a certain romance of international travel. What's destroyed our understanding of the sea is container traffic, container trade. The global commerce that uses these vast containers. It's almost like, how interesting. It's like the commercial equivalent of the modernist grid. You just pack your goods into this, and the containers go anonymously. And that's done a lot to kill the so-called romance of the sea, I think. But over against that, I would invite you to look at a film like The Forgotten Space by Alan Sekula, who was an extraordinary artist. He passed away some years ago, unfortunately. But if you look at that, for instance, he retrieves the lives of marginality, what is happening to smaller scale sea trade, what happens in shipbreaking yards like Alang, for instance, what happens to other forms of seafaring that is not destroyed by the monopolies of container trade. In those pockets of the sea, you still have some traces of what I've been talking about. And I'm not overly preoccupied by the romance of the sea. I'm not taken in by that so much. I'm far more preoccupied, if anything, with the more turbulent aspects of that history. And also its more utopian aspects. Yeah, why am I denying that? But I would like us to see this as a totality. The violence and the brutality of colonialism, of empire building, but also the way in which the seas have allowed us to be more osmotic in our cultural selves, how they've produced contact zones, how they've allowed people to produce new forms of culture. You see it in the Caribbean, you see it in the South Seas, you see it on our own coasts here. Think back to a few hundred years ago from where we are. I mean, many of us are in Bombay, and we have a certain notion of what Bombay is, for Pete's sake. I mean, think back. There was a Siddhi kingdom not far from here. People whose ultimate origin was in West Africa had a kingdom here, and they were extremely powerful. There was a sea kingdom by somebody who was mistakenly thought to be only an admiral, Angre, who the British and the French regarded as a pirate, actually had a kingdom of the sea. It wasn't a land-based kingdom. We just need to revisit our own proximate histories as well. Look at what links us, these islands here, to long prior histories.
And science fiction writing.
Okay. I mean, I'm a great fan of science fiction, but two things seem to have happened to the genre, maybe three things. Uh, One is that it's been overtaken by reality. I mean, the kind of things that are happening now, whether in nanotechnology or this incredible viral situation that we're in today, uh, advances in science fact have left science fiction a little behind in just the terms of the pragmatics of how do you imagine a whole new world that's quite different from your own. But on the other hand, science fiction has also always been a genre that has tested questions of ethics, of how we come together as societies, of what is the proper relationship between those in power and those without power. So these large ethical, philosophical, and sociological, even political questions have always been asked by science fiction. So to me, this is why whether it's great fiction or poetry that has to do with the sea or with space, these are the questions that will be asked. It's not going to be a competition between notions of how one can take the sea on as material for art and what does one do with space. Space, although we've imagined being out there for so long, we really haven't found ways of even getting out there. So for the foreseeable future, I think we're going to have to imagine what that's like. But what I would like to focus on in response to your question is really to look past the seeming differences between the genres and to see what brings them together. If I look, for instance, at the fiction of Joseph Conrad, whether it's Lord Jim, The Heart of Darkness, all these are really fables and investigations into questions of power, inequality, conflict, violence. If you look at Star Trek or Star Wars or the work of Philip K. Dick or Ray Bradbury or Isaac Asimov, Ursula Le Guin, all those also ask exactly the same questions. So it's a way of transposing ourselves, or the Matrix even. It's a way of transposing ourselves to some imaginary landscape and imaginary world and testing out for ourselves how we should live, how we should treat others, what is justice, what is love, what is conflict. So never mind the genre. That's amusing from a certain point of view, but these are the deeper questions that it demands of us.
Sorry, again. Yeah, it was again lovely to listen to your insights, especially with examples. It's quite clearer to imagine what your views are. We have one last question that has just come in.
Okay.
It says, could you throw light in brief on our proximate maritime histories?
Oh my God. As you've realized now, you wonderful, long suffering people, I tend not to do anything in brief. So, the proximate maritime histories. Okay, this time I'll really be brief. Um, what I would like us to do is to, whilst accepting indeed that Bombay, I'm going to use the word Bombay for now, has its origins in relatively closer history that has to do with the Portuguese and the British empires, let's not forget everything else that it stands for. Let's not forget that it goes back in history to, I mean, we treat Elephanta as some kind of tourist resort. Uh, why on earth would you have had such a vast investment in shrines and other forms of architectural activity there if it was some outpost? The very fact that it's there and has been there since the 3rd century tells us that this was a crucial entrepot in the Indian Ocean trade. Take that insight with you and come up the centuries to here, and you'll just see how closely connected we are to these larger circulations that link us to the Arab Peninsula, to the Mediterranean, to East Africa, all the way down to Zanzibar, down this coast to Malabar, up the coast to the Gujarat Sultanate. I'm just throwing out these names as keywords. Follow them up and you'll find those proximate histories. I'd invite you to rediscover those because as islanders sometimes tend to do, we get trapped in our notion of being isolated or insulated. Both those words come from, respectively, Greek and Latin words for island. But islands never are isolated. They're often parts of archipelagos, they're parts of larger routes, and they're always linked to some larger totality. So look for those totalities.
Thank you so much for answering all of these questions, especially this one in brief. Yeah, but I think that was all that we had for questions. So we'll be closing in with the question and answers. It was really impressive, all of your work, to actually listen to your poems from Jonah Whale, and it has been a lovely session overall. I'm sure all of our students must have enjoyed the session. So we'll be closing in with. I would like to thank all of you who joined us, and I would like to thank you, Mamta, for joining us as well.
Thank
yes,
you.
thanks. I'm mesmerized and tongue-tied as always. Nothing new. Thank you so much. I'm just going to take the liberty to reveal the name of the student who's been asking you these questions. He's Shravan Iyengar from the second year architecture, and I really hope you do get to meet each other soon.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for the questions and for having me here this afternoon. I really enjoyed this, and I hope that's true of all.